1850 to 1900. The timeline: 1861 to 1865, the Civil War. 1862, the Morrill Act, also known as the Land Grant Act of 1862. 1866, UW-Madison is named Wisconsin's Land Grant Institution. 1866, General Samuel Chapman Armstrong named Superintendent of Education for African Americans. 1868, Hampton Institute in Virginia is established by Armstrong. 1870 to 1900, the Second Industrial Revolution. 1870, Calvin Woodward introduced shop work into the Washington University in St. Louis. 1872, Otto Salomon is named head of NAS, a Swedish Slöjd school. 1876, the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, where Victor Delafosse was presenting about the Russian Imperial School. 1876, John Runkle, who was then president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was exposed to the presentation and exhibits by Victor Delafosse. 1881, Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute. 1887, the Hatch Act was implemented. 1888, Gustav Larson came to America from Sweden. 1890, the Second Morrill Act, or the Maintenance Act. External factors that impacted education during the era. Immigration brought significant populations from Europe and Asian countries. Employment became an issue that impacted education. Private schools were formed, but excluded people based on religion and culture. Public schools then began to emerge to try to address the access to education issue. The Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, African Americans had found new freedom and opportunity. However, the lack of education left them without the skills to be successful in this new life. Several leaders emerged during this time with different philosophies on how to address the issue of skills gap. The Second Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Civil War, most goods were individually crafted within local communities by skilled craftsmen and artisans. In the mid-1800s, many inventions such as the sewing machine, internal combustion engine, steam turbine, pasteurization, and the Pullman sleeping car were introduced into American societies. These inventions impacted transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and most importantly, education. This brought about educational reform in America. Vocational education was incorporated into public schools. These programs were the precursor to modern-day CTE. The manual training movement, foreign influences. The Swedish Slöjd was the first system to promote the teachings of manual labor as general education in secondary educational institutions. Principles of the Slöjd were that students were to be taught to make useful items rather than items of luxury. Otto Salomon, also known as the father of the Slöjd system of education, served as the Swedish leader of the system from 1847 until his passing in 1907. In 1872, Salomon's wealthy uncle Augusta Abrahamson purchased a large Slöjd called the NAS and put Otto in charge of the school. The Russian Imperial Technical School. The school's focus was on vocations in engineering, chemistry, drafting, and supervision. The system believed that highly trained technicians and engineers needed to have hands-on real-world experience in addition to technical knowledge. Victor Delafosse served as a professor and director of the Imperial School of Moscow. Influential leaders, philosophies, and institutions in the American manual training movement. Samuel Chapman Armstrong. In 1866, he was the superintendent of education for African Americans in Virginia. In 1868, Armstrong established the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia. The institution focused on teaching African Americans practical skills such as personal care, home care, farming, and mechanical skills. Booker T. Washington. After graduating from the Hampton Institute in 1875, Washington began working there as an administrator. In 1881, at the recommendation of Armstrong, Washington became the founding leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The institute provided training in agriculture, home economics, and industrial trades. W.E.B. Du Bois differed from Washington's beliefs, and he believed that segregated industrial educational institutions would help reinforce and sustain the social divide between black and white Americans. He felt that African Americans needed to have a more traditional, liberal education in order to become leaders. Calvin Woodward. The Washington University, he had applied mechanical students using wooden models in order to better visualize difficult concepts. They provided remedial training on how to use these woodworking tools before building the models. John Runkle was a professor and president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, he visited the Russian exhibit, meeting Victor Delafosse. Runkle felt the methods of the Imperial Technical School of Moscow could be employed to solve the problem he had been experiencing with engineering students having the appropriate knowledge but needing experience before entering the industry. He introduced shop-based tool instruction to their engineering and general education programs at MIT. Gustav Larson. In 1888, Larson came to America, bringing the Sloyd system of teaching with him. To meet the American needs, a few modifications were made to the Swedish system. The models that were used were replaced by drawings. Group instruction replaced individual instruction. Legislative acts that impacted CTE during the time. The Morrill Act of 1862, otherwise known as the Land Grant Act, was brought by Vermont Congressman Justin Morrill. It provided each state with 30,000 acres of federal land for each congressional representative for that state. Each state was to sell or lease the land in order to establish new schools or to support existing schools that would specialize in agriculture, mechanical arts, and domestic science. The Hatch Act in 1887 gave $15,000 per annum to each of the states and territories which established agricultural colleges and agricultural departments of colleges. The Second Morrill Act of 1890. Segregation prevented African Americans from attending some of the land-grant institutions. The act stipulated that any state that had created a land-grant institution and received funding from the Morrill Act of 1862 must provide African Americans with equal access to education. There is now a new skills gap. Baby boomer retirements are higher than the number of qualified skilled workers entering the workforce today, thus creating a gap that needs to be filled. The methodologies of Victor Delafosse persist. Imparting knowledge, skills, and hands-on experience still exists in CTE today. The Morrill Act grants continue for land-grant institutions. The Hatch Act, agricultural experimentations are still eligible for grants to further research. Armstrong's philosophy of everyone deserves an education exists today, and also that learning is best through manual labor. The American Sloyd, developing the learner rather than just tool skills, exists today as well. Inclusion of critical thinking, problem solving, and soft skills into the curriculum are as strong as they ever were. The manual training movement. Vocational education began to be incorporated into high schools and it still exists today.